Welcome to the deep dive, where we sift through fascinating sources to extract the core knowledge, giving you a rapid route to being well-informed without feeling overwhelmed. Think of it as intellectual treasure hunting. We dig past the superficial to unearth the truly valuable insights.
And today, we're examining the very groundwork upon which much of Western thought is built. You shared a compelling piece from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy titled The Textual Transmission of the Aristotelian Corpus. Uh, our goal is to understand the surprising journey of the texts we recognize as Aristotle's.
Precisely. Forget dry historical facts. This is a captivating detective story brimming with unexpected twists and influential figures. We're tracing the centuries-long voyage of these foundational philosophical ideas and exploring what that voyage means for our engagement with them now. It's about grasping how the act of philosophizing itself is intertwined with the fate of these texts. Okay, let's get started. One of the first fascinating points is the idea of two Aristotles.
That's right. Yeah, the source material emphasizes a key distinction, even back in antiquity. Aristotle's esoteric works, the detailed technical treatises we largely possess, and his exoteric works, primarily dialogues intended for a broader audience. Consider the esoteric writings as the internal, in-depth lecture notes used within his philosophical school.
Right. While the exoteric works were his public-facing efforts, the ones Cicero famously praised for their eloquence in making complex ideas accessible. And here's where it gets really intriguing. Almost all of those widely read dialogues are now lost, surviving only in fragments quoted by later authors.
Yeah, just fragments.
So what we primarily have access to is the dense internal dialogue of Aristotle's school, potentially missing the broader appeal and accessibility of his public-facing work. This might mean we have a more limited or even skewed perspective on his overall philosophy.
It certainly does. What's striking is Lucian's ancient observation that we get two doctrines for the price of one. The Aristotle, who engaged with the wider intellectual world through those dialogues, is almost entirely silent to us now, leaving us mainly with a more specialized, arguably more challenging material. This immediately prompts a crucial question. How might our understanding of Aristotle's philosophical method, his way of engaging with ideas for different audiences, be different if we still had those dialogues?
It definitely paints a picture of significant loss. And that sense of loss is amplified when we consider the immense span of time separating Aristotle in the 4th century BCE and the earliest surviving manuscripts, which largely date from the 9th century CE. That's over 1,000 years.
Precisely. Think about that repeated and meticulous process of manual copying across those centuries. Each copy was crafted by hand, introducing the inevitable possibility of errors, whether accidental or, intentional alterations.
Right.
The text wasn't a static object, but something that was continually being reshaped by this lengthy journey.
And it's not just minor variations. Even something as basic as the chapter divisions we find in modern editions have no manuscript basis whatsoever. They are a creation of Renaissance-era editions.
Yeah, much later.
This reminds us that even seemingly fundamental structures of these texts are not original to Aristotle, but are later interpretations and organizational choices, influencing how we read and understand his arguments.
Exactly. It's intriguing how relatively recent some of the organizational frameworks we take for granted actually are. For centuries, scholars have been striving to reconstruct and understand the original form of the text, carefully looking for those accidents and manipulations that undoubtedly occurred during the many generations of hand-copy transmission.
Which brings us to Becker's 1831 edition. This is presented as the bedrock of the modern Aristotelian corpus, right? The fundamental reference point for how we even cite Aristotle today.
Precisely. The Becker numbers that citation system you encounter in scholarly works, for example, Cat 2A3, all refer back to this specific edition. It established a standardized way to navigate this vast collection of writings.
But the source makes it clear that this collection of 45 treatises isn't the complete picture. We're missing a considerable portion of Aristotle's philosophical output.
What's important to appreciate is the sheer scope of Aristotle's intellectual endeavors. Beyond these esoteric lecture notes, he produced those dialogues we mentioned, extensive compilations of data. Imagine something akin to a comprehensive survey of animal anatomy or the constitutions of various city-states.
Wow.
Materials specifically intended for use within his school, treatises that directly engaged with the ideas of other philosophers, particularly Plato, and a diverse array of scientific works on specialized subjects. Imagine Aristotle compiling something like a vast encyclopedia of animal behavior or different forms of government in various city-states. That's the kind of detailed empirical work we've largely lost.
It's almost overwhelming to consider all that lost material. The source suggests that if we had access to it, our entire outlook on Aristotle's output or biography could be transformed.
Absolutely. For instance, the lost dialogues,
Yeah.
if they presented viewpoints closer to Plato's, have been used by some to argue for a fundamental underlying agreement between these two towering figures, or by others to suggest an earlier Platonist phase in Aristotle's intellectual development. Their absence leaves a significant void.
Right, a huge gap in our comprehension of his philosophical evolution and the nuances of his thought.
Exactly.
And even within the surviving collection, there are these fascinating features that hint at its complex history. Doublets, where identical passages appear in different books,
Yeah, the same text popping up twice.
and alternative versions of certain texts. These are like echoes or remnants of the textual transmission process. The doublets might indicate different stages of composition or maybe later editorial
Could
additions.
be. And the alternative versions suggest the text was more fluid before it achieved a relative degree of standardization.
The crucial insight here is that there's no absolute guarantee that what we read perfectly reflects Aristotle's original intentions. It's a reconstruction based on what has survived and how it has been interpreted.
Definitely a reconstruction.
Okay, so we're beginning to understand the two Aristotles, the incredibly long and complex journey of the surviving texts, and the inherent limitations of even our standard modern edition. Now, the narrative takes a rather dramatic turn with a story involving a library, a hidden underground storage, and a somewhat suspect book collector.
Ah, the legend of sepsis. This is where the human element really comes into play. Strabo and Plutarch both recount this rather colorful tale about the fate of Aristotle's library after his death. It's almost like a philosophical thriller, you know?
Exactly. So after Aristotle passes away, his extensive book collection goes to his student Theophrastus, who in turn leaves it to Nelius. But Nelius takes these invaluable works to his hometown of Sepsis, and then things take a decidedly strange turn.
Yes. The story goes that Nelius's heirs, not being particularly interested in philosophy and facing competition from the burgeoning library in Pergamon, decided to hide the books in an underground storage space. Just imagine these foundational texts slowly deteriorating due to dampness and pests for decades.
It's almost painful to contemplate. Then this character, a Pelecon of Teos, described as a wealthy collector of antiquities of great wealth and dubious morals, acquires the damaged collection and attempts to have them copied, supposedly doing a rather poor job, desperately trying to fill in missing sections. So we go from the pinnacle of intellectual achievement to literal worms eating away at foundational philosophy. What kind of impact could that physical decay have had on the texts themselves?
Well, the ancient accounts even suggest he botched the copying process. Subsequently, the Roman general Sulla sacks Athens in 86 BCE and seizes the collection, bringing it back to Rome as war booty.
Right, spoils of war.
After Sulla's death, a Greek scholar named Tyrannio gains access and undertakes some restoration work.
And finally, Andronicus of Rhodes, the figure we've been anticipating, supposedly obtains copies from Tyrannio and uses them as the basis for his edition of Aristotle's works. He's often portrayed as this pivotal figure in the rediscovery and reintroduction of Aristotle to the intellectual world.
Andronicus is indeed the first editor of Aristotle specifically named in the ancient sources. His edition is believed to have been published sometime between 75 BCE and 30 CE. He also reportedly produced tables, a biography of Aristotle, and a comprehensive catalog of his writings. Porphyry tells us that Andronicus organized the works by subject matter, grouping related treatises together.
And this all contributes to what the source terms the modern academic legend, this notion that Aristotle's works were essentially lost for centuries and only resurfaced thanks to a Pelecon and were then definitively organized by Andronicus, whose edition is reflected in Ptolemy's list of Aristotle's writings.
The legend credits Andronicus with many features of the corpus as we know it. The overall structure of works, like the metaphysics, the presence of transitional passages linking different ideas, and those internal cross-references that connect various texts. Even the existence of two different book numbering systems is sometimes linked to the idea that certain treatises were only rediscovered later and thus weren't part of earlier library classifications.
It's a captivating narrative, this idea of a lost philosophical treasure being dramatically rediscovered and organized. But as is often the case, the historical reality might be more nuanced than the legend suggests, right?
Precisely. The source presents some compelling counterarguments to the sepsis story and the absolute centrality of Andronicus's supposed rediscovery. For one, the idea that the Peripatetic school, Aristotle's own philosophical tradition, declined due to a lack of access to his books seems questionable.
Yeah, that feels a bit thin.
It's more likely that their research interests simply evolved under Strato and his successors, leading them in different intellectual directions. But if the peripatetic school continued, wouldn't they have had other copies or at least knowledge of these texts, making the lost for centuries idea a bit overstated?
That's a great point. And the notion that only a single copy of Aristotle's vast output existed at the time of Theophrastus's death seems highly improbable. We even have accounts of Eudemus of Rhodes, another of Aristotle's students, creating his own copies of Aristotle's writings.
Right. It doesn't quite add up. What's also intriguing is the connection to the famed Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Athenaeus provides an alternative account, suggesting that Ptolemy II actually purchased Aristotle's books directly from Neleus for the library.
Oh.
This directly contradicts the whole narrative of underground storage and subsequent rediscovery.
Okay, so a competing story. And Ptolemy's own list of Aristotle's works doesn't really align with the idea that everything was rediscovered by Apellicon and systematically organized by Andronicus. It seems to indicate that a significant portion of the corpus was already known and cataloged.
Furthermore, the very lack of perfect organization within the modern corpus, those doublets, blank cross-references, and inconsistent transitions, argues against the notion of a single, definitive editor like Andronicus meticulously putting everything in its final place. Porphyry, a later philosopher and scholar, only credits him with collecting treatises by subject, not with a comprehensive textual overhaul.
It sounds like Andronicus viewed himself more as a scholar engaging with existing editorial work, even making some rather significant and controversial decisions, such as rejecting the authenticity of on-interpretation and parts of categories, and dividing the physics into different sections. So when you say he rejected on-interpretation, does that mean he thought it wasn't by Aristotle, or that it didn't fit with his understanding of Aristotle's core logical works?
Well, the sources suggest he questioned its authenticity, likely meaning he doubted Aristotle wrote it. These editorial interventions demonstrate that he wasn't simply presenting a newly unearthed, flawless collection. He was actively engaging with and making judgments about the texts as he encountered them,
I see.
responding to what he perceived as previous editorial decisions and shaping the understanding of Aristotle for subsequent generations through his choices.
So the picture that's emerging is less of a miraculous recovery of lost texts and more of a continuous process of transmission, interpretation, and organization that both predates and extends far beyond the work of Andronicus.
Precisely. The source emphasizes that the canon of Aristotle's works achieved a relative stability in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, with influential commentators like Alexander Baphrodius playing a crucial role in shaping the understanding and transmission of these texts through their extensive commentaries.
Alexander of Aphrodisios, right?
Yeah.
He's a key figure.
A very key figure. And it's important to remember that the collection of works considered Aristotle at this time was still more extensive than what we possess today.
Right. And as these texts were copied and recopied by hand, errors and interpretations inevitably crept in, with diligent ancient readers attempting to locate authoritative versions and comparing different copies to discern the most accurate readings.
Exactly. The ancient commentators, such as Aspasius and Alexander, become incredibly valuable resources for us. They frequently discuss variant readings and even alternative versions of passages, providing us with crucial glimpses into earlier forms of the text that sometimes differ significantly from the medieval manuscripts that serve as the foundation for our modern editions.
Then we have the important role of the Neoplatonist schools of philosophy, who primarily focused on studying Aristotle's Organon, his logical works, as a preparatory introduction to the philosophy of Plato.
Right. Logic as a stepping stone to Plato.
And their profound influence on how Aristotle was received and transmitted in both the Arabic and Byzantine intellectual traditions.
What's particularly interesting here is how the specific goals and priorities of different philosophical schools could shape which texts were emphasized and how they were interpreted. The Neoplatonists' focus on the Organon underscores the evolving relationship between philosophical movements and the texts they deemed most important.
Sure.
The subsequent decline of these schools and later historical events, such as conquests and political upheaval, led to the unfortunate loss of a significant amount of ancient philosophical literature, including portions of the Aristotelian corpus.
The Byzantine period witnessed the crucial transition from majuscule to minuscule script in the 9th century. Think of this as a shift from all capital letters to a more flowing, lowercase writing style.
Made copying faster, right?
Exactly, which significantly increased the speed and efficiency of copying, allowing for more widespread dissemination of texts. This led to the creation of the few key manuscript copies that form the basis for virtually all later manuscripts of Aristotle. Figures like Arethusa of Caesarea, a prominent bishop and scholar, and even the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena played significant roles in preserving and studying these texts during this period.
And then the Latin conquest of Constantinople in 1204 and the subsequent translation movements into Latin and Arabic during the medieval period, with pivotal figures like Gerard of Cremona, a prolific translator working in
The
Spain,
hero of Cremona.
and William of Moerbeke, a Dominican friar who produced highly influential Latin translations directly from Greek, brought Aristotle's works to a much wider audience in the Western world.
Finally, we arrive at the Renaissance, marked by the influx of Byzantine scholars and manuscripts into Italy following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the transformative impact of the rise of printed books. This culminated in Aldus Manutius's groundbreaking first printed edition of Aristotle, and eventually in Immanuel Becker's critical edition in 1831, which for the first time systematically documented manuscript variations. It's truly an epic intellectual journey.
It is indeed, and this extensive history of transmission and interpretation has inevitably shaped how we understand even specific sections of the Aristotelian corpus, as the source now details with an examination of the Organon, the works on natural science, the metaphysics, and the ethical and political treatises. Having traced the long and winding journey of these texts, let's now turn our attention to what this tumultuous history has meant for the very content and structure of the works we had today, starting with his logical writings, the Organon.
Okay, let's begin with the Organon, that collection of 6 works on logic. The source points out that Aristotle himself didn't conceive of these treatises as a unified whole called the Organon, or even necessarily as constituting a distinct field of logic in the way we later came to understand it.
Right. What's fascinating here is that the grouping of these works and the very label organon, meaning instrument or tool, most likely emerged from Hellenistic philosophical debates about the proper place and function of this body of work within the broader philosophical system.
So it's a later framing device.
Exactly. The order in which we typically encounter them today, categories on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations, reflects a Stoic influence progression from the most basic linguistic units to the complexities of argumentation and dialectic.
But this later arrangement can actually obscure the original context and purpose of the earlier treatises, like the categories and on interpretation, which deal with concepts far broader than just what we would narrowly define as logic in a modern sense. And it's clear that there were different ways of organizing these logical works in ancient times. It makes you wonder if the more accessible Aristotle of the Lost Dialogues would have presented these logical concepts in a more readily understandable way.
That's a good question. Indeed. The library catalogs compiled by Diogenes Laertius and Ptolemy present different orderings of these texts, and even Andronicus's likely arrangement of Aristotle's logical works seems to have excluded an interpretation.
Excluded it, right. We mentioned that.
Yeah. The status of rhetoric and poetics in relation to the Organon was also a subject of debate in antiquity, with some ancient commentators considering them as part of a longer or more comprehensive view of the instrument of philosophical inquiry.
And when you delve into the individual treatises within the Organon, you uncover even more complexities and questions about their authenticity and original form. The categories, for example, has long been a subject of scrutiny, with reports of alternative versions circulating in antiquity and doubts raised about the authenticity of the post-predicaments later sections of the work.
Right, those later sections are debated. And as we've mentioned, Andronicus himself questioned the authenticity of on interpretation. The source highlights that Book V of the Topics is widely considered by modern scholars to be inauthentic.
Oh, Book V of the Topics, okay.
And the historical existence of a second book of the Poetics, focusing on comedy, remains an intriguing but largely unresolved question. Even the way Aristotle himself referred to the prior and posterior analytics collectively as simply the analytics suggests a different conceptual unity than the later division into 2 separate works, a distinction that is evident in Diogenes' list and was a point of discussion in the early century CE.
Moving on to Aristotle's works on natural science, the prologue to the Meteorology provides a fascinating glimpse into what appears to be Aristotle's intended order of study for his treatises on the natural world. He suggests beginning with the physics, followed by on the heavens, on generation and corruption and meteorology, culminating in the study of animals and plants.
That prologue is key, yeah. It gives us a potential roadmap.
It provides a valuable framework for understanding how Aristotle intended these works to be read and how they interconnected within his broader scientific project.
However, each of these individual treatises also presents its own unique set of textual challenges and points of scholarly debate. The physics, for instance, was the subject of ancient discussions regarding its division into what might be considered physics proper, books 1-5, and a separate treatise on motion, books 8.
So maybe two works combined?
Potentially. Even the authenticity of Book 7 has been questioned by scholars due to redundancies with other books and the existence of a seemingly different version known to the later commentator Simplicius.
The treatise on the heavens also appears to have a somewhat complex structure, with the possibility that it might have originally consisted of three distinct, perhaps even separately written, treatises. The very title of the work was also a subject of debate in antiquity. Furthermore, Book 3 of On the Heavens shows a clear thematic connection to the content of On Generation and Corruption, suggesting a deliberate ordering of these works by Aristotle.
Right, showing linkage. Meteorology also presents its own set of ancient concerns regarding authenticity. Some ancient commentators noted a potentially conflicting theory of sight presented in Book I compared to other Aristotelian works.
Conflicting theories.
And Book 4, which deals with the elements and their properties, seems to employ a different approach to the study of simple bodies compared to the earlier books. Interestingly, medieval Latin scholars even attempted to address the content of Book 4 with a separate treatise on minerals, highlighting the perceived distinctiveness of this section.
The relationship between this intended order of study outlined in the meteorology prologue and the extant works on animals is also a complex matter, especially considering that Aristotle's extensive work on plants has unfortunately been lost to us.
A huge loss, the botany.
Huge. However, we do find clues within the surviving animal treatises such as Parts of Animals, Movement of Animals, Progression of Animals, On the Soul, the collection known as Parva Naturalia, and Generation of Animals that hint at a potential intended sequence of study, although these internal clues are not always entirely consistent. Becker's eventual placement of On the Soul and the Parva Naturalia reflects scholarly debates during the Renaissance rather than a clear consensus from antiquity.
Right, later debates shaping the order. Even the history of animals, Aristotle's massive compilation of zoological observations, has an uncertain place within this intended sequence of study. Was it meant to be a foundational data collection informing the more theoretical treatises, or was it part of the main sequence itself?
Good question.
Intriguingly, Book X of the History of Animals circulated independently in antiquity, and debates about the authenticity of certain parts of the work continue to this day. Theodorus Gaza, a 15th century translator, even rearranged the books of History of Animals in his Latin translation, further highlighting the fluidity of its structure in the manuscript tradition.
The collection of short treatises known by the Latin title Parva Naturalia also has a composite nature. While unified by a prologue found in On Sense and Sensibilia, the individual treatises seem to have had a somewhat independent existence. Ancient commentators even included movement of animals within this collection, and conflicting textual clues within the Parva Naturalia itself make its intended placement within the overall study of nature somewhat ambiguous.
Okay, this brings us to the Metaphysics, a treatise that has been a subject of philosophical inquiry and a textual puzzle since antiquity itself. The very title, whether it signifies after the physics in terms of its placement in a curriculum or first philosophy in terms of its subject matter, hints at the editorial complexities and the ongoing debate about the relationship between the text as we have it and Aristotle's original philosophical project.
The Metaphysics presents us with several intriguing textual features, including two different versions of what appears to be Book 1, known as Alpha Major and Alpha Minor.
Two book ones, yeah.
The presence of doublet passages both within the Metaphysics itself and in other Aristotelian works, and the distinct character of Book Delta, which seems like it may have originally been a separate, self-contained work titled On Things Said in Several Ways.
Like a philosophical dictionary almost.
Right. These features raise fundamental questions about whether the Metaphysics was ever intended to be a unified, cohesive project. The ancient tradition even connects this treatise to Aristotle's student Eudemus of Rhodes, suggesting the possibility of later textual disarray due to loss and less than competent editing.
The Greek title, Ta Meta ta Physica, likely originated in the Hellenistic period, and the Metaphysics appears in the lists of Aristotle's works compiled by Ptolemy and Hesychius, although with differing numbers of books, suggesting a somewhat fluid conception of its contents.
Differing book counts. Interesting.
Doubts about the authenticity of Book Alpha were already voiced in antiquity, with Alexander Ephroditus defending its Aristotelian authorship, while others attributed it to a later figure named Pasicles. Its coexistence with the shorter book Alpha Minor further complicates the picture, suggesting the possibility of philosophically motivated textual interventions or the incorporation of different sets of lecture notes. Similarly, the authenticity of Alpha Minor and the completeness of Book Delta have been questioned by scholars, and there are serious doubts surrounding the authenticity of Book Kappa. Intriguingly, Book Theta contains an additional text that some scholars believe may be a genuine but misplaced fragment of Aristotle's thought.
A misplaced piece.
Possibly. And there is ongoing debate about the original boundary between books Mu and Nu.
Okay, so lots of questions around the metaphysics. Finally, let's turn our attention to Aristotle's works on ethics and politics. In the modern corpus, we find 4 ethical treatises: the Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudemian Ethics, the Magna Moralia, and the Pseudo-Aristotelian work on virtues and vices.
Right, 4 of them. The Magna Moralia is generally considered to be a later summary of Aristotelian ethics likely produced within his school, its title referring to its greater length compared to other similar summaries.
What's particularly noteworthy are the significant similarities in philosophical views and overall structure among the Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudemian Ethics, and the Magna Moralia. All 3 works address the same core topics in a largely consistent order.
They mirror each other quite a bit.
Furthermore, there exist 3 common books that are included in both the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. Many modern editions, however, choose to omit these shared books from the Eudemian Ethics, highlighting the complex editorial decisions involved in presenting these texts.
The precise relationship between the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics, as well as the status and original placement of these common books, remains a subject of considerable scholarly debate. One possibility is that these shared books represent later editorial editions, or even that the 2 ethics themselves are, in some sense, editorial artifacts derived from a common source.
Editorial artifacts. That's interesting.
If the common books are included, the Nicomachean Ethics even contains a double passage on the topic of pleasure, and the composition of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7th, Eudemian Ethics, Book 6, appears somewhat problematic.
The very meanings of the designations Eudemian and Nicomachean are rather obscure. Ancient lists of Aristotle's works provide conflicting information, with Diogenes Laertius mentioning only 1 ethics, while Ptolemy's list includes the Magna Moralia and the Eudemian Ethics, but not the Nicomachean Ethics.
So the Nicomachean is missing from Ptolemy's list.
Seems so. Interestingly, Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, seems to have been familiar with the Nicomachean Ethics, suggesting its circulation at a relatively early date. Various hypotheses have been proposed to explain the titles, linking them to potential authorship or editorship by Aristotle's student Eudemus and his son Nicomachus, or perhaps to dedications of the works.
So named after Eudemus or Nicomachus, maybe?
That's the theory. The later commentator Aspasius, in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, even questions Eudemus's authorship of a passage found in the common books, and subsequent ancient sources offer different interpretations of the significance of these titles.
It's also worth noting the surprising connection of the politics with the name of Aristotle's successor Theophrastus in Diogenes Laertius's list of Aristotle's writings, suggesting Theophrastus's potential involvement in its compilation or transmission.
Theophrastus involved in the politics.
Okay. Furthermore, the non-continuous and somewhat disjointed nature of the politics as we have it has led scholars to propose various alternative orderings of its constituent books.
Lastly, the source addresses the Spuria, those inauthentic works that have been included in the modern Aristotelian corpus. These were likely produced within the intellectual environment of the Lyceum shortly after Aristotle's death.
Right, the stuff that's probably not him. Examples include treatises on breath, on colors, physiognomonics, on marvelous things heard, as well as the Magna Moralia, and on virtues and vices that we've already discussed, and a work economics.
Scholars have attributed some of these works to other members of the Lyceum, such as Theophrastus or Strato.
Right, his students or successors.
And ancient editors likely grouped them together with Aristotle's genuine works due to their origin within his school. Neoplatonist commentators frequently engaged with questions of authenticity concerning these texts. Ammonius, a 5th century commentator, even offers several explanations for the existence of forgeries.
Why fake Aristotles existed.
Exactly, ranging from incentives offered by royal libraries to the confusion arising from similar titles and the attribution of disciples' work to their master.
We have examples of clear forgeries, such as the Rhetoric to Alexander, as well as more controversial cases where the evidence for authenticity remains inconclusive, such as the treatise on Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias, and the work on the universe, which exhibits Stoic philosophical influences. Interestingly, the constitution of the Athenians was generally considered authentic in antiquity.
There are also works that are even further removed from Aristotle's original texts, such as On Things Heard, which survives primarily as excerpts in Porphyry's writings,
Just bits and pieces again.
and On Plants, which reached us through a complex route of translation. A Renaissance Greek translation based on a medieval Latin translation, which itself was based on an Arabic translation of a likely Greek original by Nicholas of Damascus, possibly drawing upon Aristotle's lost work on botany.
Wow, that's quite a journey for one text. Greek to Arabic to Latin to Greek again.
Isn't it? Similarly, we have only a fragment of a work titled The Situations and Names of Winds.
Finally, we have collections like The Problems and The Mechanics, which appear to be compilations of disjointed treatments of various topics. While they may contain some authentic material due to similarities in titles and cross-references found in genuine Aristotelian texts, their overall structure suggests multiple authors and a later date of composition within the Lyceum.
So kind of like collaborative works, maybe?
Could be. The Problems covers a remarkably wide range of subjects and exhibits inconsistencies in approach, further supporting the idea of multiple contributors. The Mechanics, while shorter and containing a preface, also faces arguments against its authenticity based on the absence of cross-references to other Aristotelian works, terminological discrepancies, and a reference to a Hellenistic Egyptian device, suggesting a later origin.
Okay, so to bring this detailed exploration to a close, what is the fundamental insight for you, our listener, after this journey through the intricate history of Aristotle's texts?
Well, the essential takeaway is that the texts we read and study as Aristotle are not pristine, directly transmitted words from the philosopher himself. Instead, they are the product of a long, complex, and truly fascinating history of transmission, manual copying, editorial decisions, and layers of interpretation that span centuries.
Right. Engaging with Aristotle's thought necessarily means engaging with this rich and sometimes uncertain textual history.
Absolutely. And here's a final thought for you to consider. How might this understanding of the making of Aristotle influence the way we approach other foundational thinkers and their works? Does having this awareness of the complex textual journey enrich or perhaps complicate our understanding of their enduring philosophical contributions?
That's a great question.
It certainly prompts us to reflect on the profound impact of historical processes on the very act of philosophical inquiry through texts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.